professional and then stand here and say that building it around inconsistency, alleged claim to be of Dr. McDonald. That is just simply not conceivable to me that the jury can find beyond a reasonable doubt that one, that there are in fact significant inconsistencies. Two, that if they are matters which are understandable and rational, but no reasonable person, given the circumstances, would be able to answer these things. Three, do we not give Dr. McDonald credit for at least being open and willing to talk and cite it to his excuses for year after year after year? The vain hope and bad advice to think that perhaps if we talk sense to people, they will believe sense. Government has done a great deal with the pictures of the wounds that Dr. McDonald taken in 1974 to the grand jury. Remember, we got those pictures around here. We have Dr. McDonald pointing here, 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 and elsewhere. And they want to stare at. I don't know what's supposed to be there. More than 4 and a half years after the injuries, what did they expect to find? I mean, first of all, you should consider the fact that they would give it voluntarily. Jeff said, no way, you will never listen to sense. You want me to answer your unanswerable theories? You submitted to that process. But those are not the only things that are hard to see in this case. That is, to see 4 and a half years later injuries. What about Mr. Medicine? The invisible ridge lines on the footprints on the floor. Why are we not holding the government with this witness, Mr. Medicine, for the same text? Why should we believe Medicine for a second that he saw ridge lines on the bloody footprint on the floor, and that those ridge lines in his mind were capable of being compared, identified that Dr. McDonald? Nobody else saw it. Why weren't they photographed? That's no valid explanation. Dr. Osborne had made it clear that anything you can see with your eye, you can photograph, unless you don't have the confidence to not only photograph, but to do the job of the fingerprint examiner. Let's hold Medlin to the same standard. Invisible evidence. He can't even get it so out of the floor to take it back to Fort Gordon, where maybe they could do something with it without it falling apart. Why don't we hold the government? Well, we should, because the burden is there to this case. Sambo's pot, another piece of invisible evidence. I talked about it before. The blood stain of the governor, they say, you can see. If this looks real close, that's the one with the light box we could not see. Let's hold it in the same standard as state. It just does not make any sense that Dr. McDonald was full to criticize. Apparently, if you listen to that speech this morning, in 9.5 years, Dr. McDonald hasn't done a thing right. His lawyers don't do anything right. We are just always getting you looking the wrong direction. The only thing he's done right is try and talk to them, try and cooperate with them, to try and tell what we knew, and to hope in the name of justice instead to somebody who listens. Government says, well, there are no intruders in this case. There's no proof of intruders in this case. So a list of evidence that supports Jeff's story will surprise you when we pull it all together right now. First of all, the latex glove. I stand on Dr. Wynn's testimony. I stand on the thought that he threw down to the government as to why, if you think that I'm wrong, you don't go out today, 79, in a day, and check my findings. The unanswered challenge. Where do they come from? They came from some other source than Jeff has done this one. What about the fighter found on Jeff's glasses in the living room? They have tried and tried and tried, and they cannot find any source from within the McDonald house where that fiber came from. Where do they think it came from? It flew in the window? Nonsense. Because the wife is believe that those that fiber, one more piece of physical evidence that supports an opposite inference to what the government does. Unidentified hair. There's hair in this case. The government has found they've had McDonald samples and given to them, and they still to this day cannot ascribe to any member of the family. There are fingerprints. We've talked about the ones that are found and that were not lifted properly, ones that are found and not identified, partial or not complete, the ones that were never found because they left frost the premises. What about the candle wax? 3 different candles produce 3 different types of wax. They went and they rounded up everything they found in the house. And they found 14 candles. They took it to the lab. And when they got done at their best efforts, what did they find? That the wax that is found in the gun lab, in the living room. Jack says he remembers the one with a flickering light. This, I think, the reasonable conclusion was talking about a woman with a candle. The reasonable conclusion is that is evidence of the suicide. And what did the government do about that? A witness said, well, we didn't take that seriously because the wax was hard. How long did it take to harmonize, say, through the room? 3 weeks. When did you examine the wax? March 6th, 1970. February 7th. See, the March the 6th is 3 weeks. And he's surprised that the wax was harder. What I'm saying to you is the conclusion is, the reasonable conclusion, if you are wrong, is that the wax found in that hat, unidentified to this day, is consistent with Jeff's story of the flickering light in the hand of the woman. The knob, the wax, are consistent with intruders. There is no which says from it that Jeff or Colette owned anything like the hickory knife, anything like the old Geneva knife. As a matter of fact, it was Mildred Cassav who took a look at these weapons and pronounced that her daughter and son-in-law would not own bent, rusted, obviously mistreated instruments like this. From that stand right there, she was told after the weapon and pronounced them not in her daughter's house, not in her son-in-law's house, had she ever seen them, and didn't believe they were the type of things that they would have. No one else in this case, Pamela Cochran, Pamela Kalen Cochran, or anyone else has ever identified those weapons in the McDonald house. How did they get there? How did they get there? And this doesn't block the right side. The ice. Fascinating piece of evidence. There are 2 people out of all of the myriad people available to the government who believe that they were the ice pit in the McDonald house. Again, Mildred Cassav says that she believes it's the ice pit, but it did not look like this one. That is my recollection of her testimony. I ask you to search your own recollection of what she says. Boy goes down to Pamela Kalen Cochran. 15 and a half or 16-year-old babysitter back in 1970, now a young woman, comes in here and admits on the stand in 1970 that she was shown pictures, could not identify any of the weapons, was asked about it, did not remember ever seeing an ice pick in the dollhouse. You would think that that was the end of that issue. But you know, I guess the government's theory is to go on long enough. You can wear somebody down, be it Jeff McDonough or anybody else. And so there she is. She goes to the grand jury in August of 1970, or later than that, 1974. And in the morning, she's asked about the ice. Doesn't doubt. Doesn't recall. Then she goes to lunch and comes back. And sitting there, 4.5 years later, see the picture of Colette McDonald's body with puncture holes on it and have her visions. She has the vision that now she remembers seeing ice in the McDonald house. Certainly she can't identify this one specifically, but as ice in the McDonald house. Can you say to yourself that you have confidence in that kind of evidence? Can you say to yourself, you really have belief that a person can have a vision of having handled an ice pick in the McDonald house 4.5 years later on that basis when questioned about it, when the crime took place by CID, my other person connected with the military prestige. Military gets off, says that doesn't look like a law. Pass for Caleb, I think there's a nice thing in the house, but never thought about it 4.5 years later till I had the subtle flash insight. You conclude, members of the jury, that that is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that this weapon came from this house. I think not. Where did it come from? Where did the other knives come from? That is consistent with intruders being in the house. The club. Little bit of split-free business, I think, on the part of the government. Here we have this wonderful model. I think this model told us probably where the fuck came from. You'll never see it, but somebody got digital guys through. I think the evidence would be fair for a jury to conclude that that fuck found the house, that it was once part of a larger piece of wood, and where you think that came from. On this model, there was a jury, every conceivable detail that anyone could want was on there. There's even the dang telephone with curled wire. I mean, of all of the trivia that built in. But when it comes to a piece of evidence that could have some bearing on the case, where, members of the jury, is the pit outside the back of the house where there was wood found and seen by CID. Please examine the great model here that's supposed to represent the house in its critical detail so that we can work together and see what we understand the crime. There's a little piece of paper here put here when we ask another witness to point out where he is. That is not something to recommend. There is no indications by the government thus where that. But look at the photos. Taken by the CID on February 17th. We will look here. What is this? Painted pieces of wood sitting in the back of the house. I'll show you the larger picture in a second, which show the same thing. Maybe point out then there's another black and white photograph showing more of the wood at the angle of the other one does not show it. And lastly, of course, the door, which is partially open here, apparently left that way to whoever did the left, is fully open. What's there is lots more scrap wood, not on the line. He just takes it. But if nothing else, it is reasonable for you to infer that the piece of wood that was used so brutally and monstrous in the case came from that little well outside the house here in the back. The well, the government chooses not to show anyone, not to put on the great model here, because one, it might just suggest to the jury that the model is indicating that this is a source for this weapon that is not in the house at the time of the crime. You get a better view further of that. And how perfectly clear it is that is here on the photographs back to the McDonald house, how perfectly visible it is to anyone coming that way in the direction from, if you will, anyone else's house would happen to live in Corregidor, of course, coming this way, perfectly visible and seen all around. Speaking about visibility, by the way, one of the other interesting gaps in the government's proof beyond a reasonable doubt is where were the knives found? They're found out here. The club is found quite close by here. There are photographs that show the knife is found quite over here. How did the ice pick and the knife get out there? Did Jeff come out and walk out here? What did he walk on? Sandy soil, which they were looking for finger footprints in. Did he have any dirt on the sole of his feet when Micah saw him and Tavir saw him and the medic saw him? How did he get it out there? Pretty clear from the photograph, I think, members of the jury, that you yourselves can tell. There's no likelihood it can be tossed out there, and the angles are not apparent enough to you. But there are more photographs here. Here you have the ice pick at this particular angle underneath the shaded area by the bush here. How do you get out there? Look at the standing soil. What do we know about that? Is there proof in this case that McDonald is some fiendish plan and ingenious beside running from room to room, doing all the other absurd things a woman would have to do? But he also managed to run out there, to tuck the ice pick under the bush, get back in, make sure her soul don't show it out there, make sure there are no footprints in the sandy soil out there. Good heaven. Never the truth. Where is there proof of this? But there is more proof of the intruders. Besides the latex, the fight, the hair, the wax, the fingerprints, and the weapons. There's more. The list goes on. Kenneth Mike, on the way, saw the woman in the hat. They called variously floppy hat, rain hat. That is important, not because anyone would draw any certain conclusion as to whether that woman was in fact a suspect in his head. That's not. Professor Osberg, again, teaching us something about criminal investigation, points out a live justice within 500 blocks of a crime scene at that time of day. That is the highest priority. Anybody around has to be considered a suspect in general terms. If not in terms of a suspect of a crime, as a potential informant. Did that woman see anybody? Did you see a car go by her? Did you see a blue Mustang by any chance? Did you see anything else? What happened? That woman's presence indicates this area was not barren, not void of other human beings. Remember, the government went through great pains with all the CID people who came to the house of the MP. Did you see anything on the way? Did you see any people on the way, like mocking the idea, just literally making fun of the idea that anyone could have been in the vicinity of all of this invention of 4 people is just figment of Jeff's imagination. Yet here, there is evidence of a person. And how does an MP and CID forces respond to that? They got the slightest indication that anybody went at that time prompt to try and find that person, to see whether or not that person had anything about them that might bear on this crime. Then there's Mr. Miller. I think the government should be ashamed of itself for mocking Mr. Miller. They have made absolutely ridiculous what is a serious matter because it doesn't fit their theory in this case. Now, Mr. Miller told us it's utterly bizarre episode. It's bizarre not because the world's told. It's bizarre that people, we live in a kind of sheltered world. We deal with people that we know, our friends, our acquaintances, and business people we deal with, this is not that kind of behavior. This is bizarre. He looks out of his window. He looks out of his door, and he sees 3 people with candles walking toward the McDonald house. Now, what's the importance of that? It's important in a number of ways. First of all, it shatters the government's argument that it's absurd to think that anybody around, outside, corregidor reports that the McDonald is guilty of absolute fabrication. It ought to remove that issue from your deliberations entirely. The things that anyone would seriously question whether there could have been persons about who were not seen by the military police. I think some of you who perhaps have never lived on a military post have a kind of a feeling that you're living in a safe armed half there with all an MP patrol. You certainly learn something about that. There is no certainty that such patrols existed, that they ever saw these utterly bizarre things going on. Why should Mr. Miller be permitted to look at the gun? I'll tell you why. Look, he saw this and didn't call the MPs. Didn't call the CID. I would suspect, you have a right to draw this conclusion, that he had about as much expectation of getting anyone to come see him as Detective Beasley from the Fayetteville Police Department had when he called CID and said, hey, I have 4 suspects for you in the McDonald Justice. That would not be as much expectation anyone in hindsight could have had that anyone would have showed up to the CID. It didn't call. Why? So I lived right for immediate setting. My expectation was that competent professional people, they would canvass the neighborhood. He was out of the army by the end of April. He did not bother to call anyone back. What is the reasonable inference you might draw? He concluded that they didn't need her. They didn't need any information from people that they go, why do you have to call them up? They know what they're doing, don't they? You know better. You know better than that. But why would he not have assumed that? Then what happens next? McDonald's case goes through the military proceedings. It ends in the end of October of 1970. There's widespread notoriety of that. It's over with. Why did Millen have to call anybody then? When does he call someone? When, to his surprise, he learns the case is a lie. And for that, he is mocked and made a fool of by the government's attitudes. I think that's despicable. And anything is intended to discourage a citizen from coming forward is to hear outside this court how government counsel responds to people, think they have information, wait for the investigator to do the right thing, hear the case over with, and then when they come forward to be abused verbally in that fashion. What else do we know about intruders? Is this really a ridiculous story? 4 people, the woman in the floppy hat, as the government continues to mock. We were subjected here to the trashy article from Blackburn magazine. An article which the only evidence that Ron Harrison and Jeff talked about briefly because of the bizarre episode about Lydia the Swat. And went on to other things. God, if they had only known that they had started reading that we would all be subjected to the list, to that absolute piece of trash, they would probably pay the article a little more carefully. But the important thing about that article is this. The government wants you to conclude that in California, there were these bizarre happenings going on, that McDonald read about it, and that planted this wonderful, masterful idea in its head. And what P.E. Beasley said, I read it, and that is a description of a part of the counterculture, underworld, backstreet life in the Haymont section of Fayetteville. It is drug culture, Fayetteville, 1969-1970. Witchcraft. Can you imagine killing cats and goats? The bizarre kind of behavior. Drugs of every kind, paranoid behavior, violence of all sorts. Beasley makes it real. Nothing to be clear. He is a professional police officer for 20 years. That was his beat. That was an area. He worked on drug matters in that area. He comes and says, there's nothing in that article that they read that one needed to know about, to know that the acid is groovy. The pigs were the word of the street. What interesting idea we're subjected to. But the importance of it is this, that the sickness that reflected in that article, kind of sick mind, sick behavior, was a disease that was just as present outside of the Fort Bragg in Fayetteville as it was any place else. One did not have to re-escort. One only had to be alive in America to know Charles Manson and the terrible killings there. Even Helena Studley, who doesn't read, but just heard at the radio, didn't read books, but knew about that man, knew about Manson and the rest of that. One didn't have to bring in, and from this article, argue to you beyond a reasonable doubt, for this is the source of the idea that McDonald had. In truth, if the issue in this case was how many people can you prove knew that activist movie with a term on the street, that active was a term used by dope music or LSD, that all of these expressions, all this language, was common when the street people were into drug abuse. We could be all convicted, I suppose, of something if that were the test. It's not. It's meant to take a. What about everything else in Jeff's house? What about the articles about saving lives in magazine, medical journals? Why don't we read them all to you? I have temptation to subject all of us to our endless reading of all things in the house. Say, I'm balanced. Was the man thinking of life or thinking of death? But I thought better that I didn't. What else do we know about? Are there intruders? Are the idea of intruders real in this case? How about Polina Scozzini? Officer Beasley has taught us something about life in Fayetteville. But she ran with a man in Allen Madero, and that Nazarov was a man he considered dangerous, man considered violent. But Helena Stokely, when she was in this court, can you imagine 9.5 years later, puffy face from hepatitis, and her arm in a cast because she's been beaten again by one of her friends. Violence present in her life, the kind of monstrous violence that committed the crimes here. Betting is. Dr. Hughes was here yesterday. What did he say? Under LSD, maybe the lights are flashing, but you see the light. You know, and you think you can do it better than anybody else, but you can do it. You can murder, you can commit violence, you can drive a car, you can play music, you can do all those things. There's only a friend. We'll talk about him later. What about Jeff's injuries? It is clear that no doctor with Jeff McDonald's intelligence would stab himself in the place he did, because just in case the person didn't get your message on the phone and the help didn't get to you, you would be dead. Now, what kind of brilliant scheme is that? To hide horrendous murders by faking an injury in a place where you just might die himself. Jeff is either the intelligent man that even the government concedes he is, or he is the lunatic who hasn't planned this out very carefully that the government's infancy would have you believe. I want to talk to you a bit now about the last area that I want to talk to you about, then ask my colleague Wade Smith to talk to something else. I'll make it brief. The question here is, what is the role of the instructor in this case? Again, we are like living in a time warp. We see her 9.5 years later after. I need to ask you for a minute, try and go back in time, if you will, to 1907. How did she become an issue in this case? Is she an invention of me? Is she an invention of Jeff McDonald? If you think about the evidence in this case, when the descriptions went out over the radio, who is the person that saw Alina and her band of fellow travelers as potential suspects in this case? Some defense lawyer, some advocate for the defendant's position to that, or did a professional police officer? PPB. The answer is B. What else brings Alina Stokely in this case? William Posey, postman, who testified in 1970, and here again as a next-door neighbor of Alina Stokely, and who puts her into this case too, because he sees her leave around midnight, February 17th, come back between 4:30 and 5 in the morning in the blue Mustang, see her running to the house, saw her always before that time with her characteristic floppy hat, blonde wig, and boots, and from that next day onward, never saw it again. Is he an invention of the defendant and myself? Again, the government makes fun. Why did you come forward, Mr. Bixie? If you come forward at all, you get mocked. If you don't come forward because you think they don't meet you, you get mocked. You can't win. You can't win until finally a jury gets to decide the case. And then there's the result.
Mr. Segal, you have 5 minutes left of your total time.
My impression will be that's at 4:30 now.
Well, you have 3 hours and 15 minutes, and you've used 3 hours and 10 minutes.
I'm going to do injustice to Helena Stokely's role, because I think I want you to hear what Wade has said he wanted to talk to you about. It's a question about the one remaining issue in this case. Just let me say this about Helena Stokely. Not only did Posey put her into this case, since the government says, look, she got rid of the blonde hat, the wig, the hat, and the booth because of harassment. Posey says she got rid of it the next day. How much harassment would there have been by February 18th? Helena Stokely was put into this case by people to whom she talked to. People in Nashville, Officer Gaddis. She was part of a crowd to whom acid was really brutal. Until in 1973, she said, or 72, She gave it up because she said, remember the dialogue we had? I don't follow any man. I asked her what man seemed she believed in following a leader. And she said, but I do follow the drug. That's why I gave up LSD. Because of what it did to her. Alina Stokely also told us about the rocking horse that she believes seeing a Christmas event. The government leaps forward with a copy of the Fayetteville newspaper. But you see the trouble with that again, it's a half-truth. Fascinating, because how did the Fayetteville reporters or photographer get out of the down house full of forges and MPs and the orange home and take a picture from the window? Wonderful protection of the crime scene and the lab teams at work. Through the soil, through the sandy soil. Got a picture right away. But there's something in the picture that makes it different. Because Melina says the rock was broken. The rock was broken. That's not what the picture says. How did she know that? How did she know that? Down the rocks. There's much more that one want to say about her. Except that, how do you explain that in the day of the McDonald funerals, people she says she never met, she wears black, steel wreaths, never had them before, wears a black veil. Thereafter, tries to get someone the same day to go to McDonald's family with her. The government's explanation, I suppose, is going to be her brain was besotted by LSD. Look, you heard what Dr. Hughes had to say. You saw her here. She was a police informant, not only in Fayetteville, her brain was working in NASA. She was reliable. Beasley didn't say that her brain was besotted. She knew what she was up to. She was dealing drugs on the street. Her head was into money. Her head was into drug culture. Why in the name of heaven did the government not follow the lead that Beasley put in her hand on the next day after the murders? Did not send a CID agent. I wanted to talk to you about the picture in this case. There are many things I won't touch upon. I ask you not to do this, Mr. Jewett. Do not conclude from the fact that I have not talked about so many other issues in the time available to us, to conclude that there are not alternate explanations or theories. I only want to leave you with this thought, and I'm going to ask you to talk. And that thought is that it was never our explanation. It was never Jeff's responsibility to offer an explanation. Never my obligation for explanation. We only point these things out to you to show you the existence of far more rational and peacefully acceptable alternative hypothesis to what the government has here at the Senate. And since the burden of proof is on the government, from the beginning to the end, I submit to you, they never have met it before, they do not need it. There's one remaining question, and that's the one I'm going to talk about.
Yeah, I'm still here, but I haven't seen you all afternoon. We're going to take our recess now, and we'll come back at 4:30. Remember all the things. Don't fight without your case. Come back at 4:30.
Right. The United States is the foreign orders of Southern distress. Further dispatch of business that full first. This all of the United States District Court now is in the city for further dispatch of business. Please be seated and come to work. Your Honor, the government has, as I understand, 40 minutes.
That's right.
Is out of time. We have agreed since Mr. Smith time had an opportunity to speak to you 10 minutes.
Well, you know, Mr. Smith, he just give his name and address in 10 minutes.
Well, I say this is one quid pro quo we intend to enforce.
All right. Mr. Smith,
You're speaking as I'm grateful for the 10 minutes. I would ask Your Honor to tap the bench, please, when 10 minutes is concluded. Ladies and gentlemen, they say that no souls are saved anyway after 20 minutes. I've always heard that said, and so with 10 minutes, I could be able to save all the souls if I had anything at all to say. I wanted to speak to you today about a different approach
to an examination thesis, and that is to put aside for just a moment the scientific aspects of the examination. Well, that's very important, and I think it worked. And I think the scientific evidence in this case is good. I think our scientific evidence in this case is truly outstanding. But there's a better way, as far as I'm concerned. That is to just, for lack of a better way to explain it, let your insides talk to you for a minute about the case. What do you feel? What are you feeling about the case? In our opening statement, we said to you that this was a family where there were life motives, and that we would show you that there were life motives. I believe that we have kept our promise to you. Life motives to me mean things like this: working 3 jobs, having children, planning for a better life, acquiring new possessions, furniture, urging each other to be better, just urging Colette to go to college, to complete her education, just running, keeping fit, adding to the family the fact that Colette was pregnant, and all kinds of other things that show that this family was teeming with life, just absolutely teeming with life. The animals, for example, the pony's been mentioned over and over again. The other pets that they had. It was a home where they were truly living. It was not a situation where you'd so often read he was a loner. He was, as we look back on it, he was drinking too much. He was taking drugs. They had been fighting and arguing for months. She was always showing up with bruises. The children were always showing up with bruises. The children were battered. The children were sad. There was none of it. There's no evidence that there was any alcohol. There's no evidence that there was any drug of any kind in this man's blood. So it is a situation where things were happening that were good. Everything was going well. What had the government been able to point out that would show to the contrary? Mr. Blackburn, I think, readily admitted that the fact that the child was dead had just simply cannot be. The fact that he was with another woman on a couple of occasions, we're sorry about. He's sorry. And we don't treat that lightly or flippantly. But sure, that's no reason for him to have drawn reserve and destroyed his family. Looking at an afterthought, something that happened later, the fact that he told Mr. Segal a lie does not indicate for a moment that he would have destroyed his family. The prosecution in this case, I think, is in a terrible dilemma. I would assume that it is somewhat embarrassing to them. And that is that the most eloquent witness in this has taken the witness stand every single day, and that is that there is no motive. Don't you wonder why when you think about it? Why did it happen? Don't you wonder when you're thinking about whether Jeff did it, why would he have done it? You think of a reason why he would have done it. There is. Now, the prosecution is not under any obligation to furnish a motive. The law does not place that burden on them. Nevertheless, that's natural law. That's law that we feel inside of us, every one of us. We feel that we can say to the prosecution, in any case, tell us why. Tell us why this man would destroy his family. Think about the photographs that you saw of Jeff with the family, Jeff with the children, Colette with the children. The children played. Think about Major Moore arriving at an unscheduled lunch stop. Think about the children running out and grabbing Jeff, climbing all over him. A few weeks before this time, think about how Colette came to him and announced with joy that she's expecting the child. Think about how they embraced, according to Major Moore. How they walked in the house, Jack with his arm around her, Major Moore walking with the children, talking, enjoying themselves at the lunchtime. Everything was going well. There was not anything going on in their home that you have seen in this house that would indicate that this man would do a thing like this. The contrasts are incredible. The contrasts are fantastic. You think about this, that Jeffrey MacDonald lived his life and nothing like this ever happened to him. And think about the fact that he has lived his life since then and nothing like this has happened since. It makes no sense. Don't you know? Don't you know? If something had been going on in that home, that was bad. Don't you know? Neighbors would have observed it. Don't you know Major Moore would have seen it? Don't you know Jeff's mother would have seen it? Don't you know when she was down there at Christmas or New Year's and out together? She lived there. And don't you know Thanksgiving when she was there? If something bad had been going on, if they were headed for a calamity like that, she would have gone. But I say to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that if you will examine the testimony of the witnesses who took a stand for Jesus, they are little windows into that home. You can look into any of the windows. Little windows into the home. All the witnesses who came and said that this recently, they give you a window into the home. If you want to completely disregard Mr. McCollum's testimony and not think anything at all about it, but just think about the other things that they finished them, they will give you insight into what was happening. No motive. It is unbelief. It is incredible. Don't you know that Jeff Goss not have destroyed its children? You know that was no reason. If you look at the on photograph of those little children, infected to cause someone to raise a knife, destroy, Lord Chris, not just destroy, but absolutely mutilate. Just feed her. Thrust after thrust after. He needs peace. He hasn't had a long time. You as a jury, immensely powerful, because you can get defeated for the first time in years. Thank you.
See?
You know, I couldn't help but think during the last 10 minutes, listening to we talk about most, you know, and the unbelievability of it all. And I suppose in a way it is unbelievable that a successful person might kill his family, that a person to whom his children cry daddy might raise his hand in anger or rage or coolness, perhaps, kill his family. But I can't help thinking back to what I said late this morning. We don't contend that Dr. Donald killed his family because Kristen Vett was dead. We contend, ladies and gentlemen, Senator killed his family because events overtook themselves. Two things. Think of yourself for a moment in your own daily lives. If you've been angry at someone, not really mean to good, and you raised your hand, maybe to your eye, but you never, followed through. Suppose when you're tired, late in the morning or early in the morning, and you're worn out, and things just aren't going on, that you do, and can regret you've done something that is irretrievable. Everything else, ladies and gentlemen, we say, and that crime scene flowed from that moment. I don't say to you that the defendant, as I said this morning, has always been a bad person. I don't say to you that for the last 9 years he has been a bad person. But I do say to you, early morning of the 17th of February, time stopped in the McDonald home. And for a flicker of a second, something happened that yet shadowed, caused frantic events unfold. Was necessary for self-survival. Mr. Segal, in his presentation this afternoon, attacked again. He attacked the CIA. He attacked Stonewall, Shirley Green, anybody who has ever been with the government. Out of home was attacked. He said that our case was like a house built on sand. I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, the only sand in this case is that which was perhaps attempted to be thrown into your eyes and keep you from seeing the evidence in this case. He said that you would write the final chapter. Wade Smith said you might have the power to give the defendant peace. We suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that regardless of whether it is innocent, or guilty, you don't have the power to give the defendant peace. He said that we were nonpartisan. I suppose there's a grain of truth in that. We are advocates. We are pushing a point of view. But let me tell you why. Because we believe it to be true. And I am sure to say he went over the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. And I think implied to you that we have to show each little item beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not what we have to show. We got to show you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed these crimes, however we do it. Whether we do it
this way or that way, whether you believe this or believe that, you could throw out 90% of our evidence. But if you believe the other 10%, and that's you, that the defendant was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, that's okay. Just so long as we convince you beyond a reasonable doubt that he did. He taught that we had misstated some principle of law dealing with the burden shifting from the government to the defendant. We did not mistake that. We did say he didn't explain. You know, Wade talked a minute ago about what's inside. Well, that's what's inside when the defendant takes a stand and does not attempt to explain the unexplainable. When he is asked questions and doesn't give an answer and relies on his counsel to answer for him. We rely, ladies and gentlemen, and ask you to rely on the law of common sense. I will repeat it again this afternoon because it makes a whole lot of sense. Don't you know, if he could have, he would have. He says the physical evidence doesn't say anything. It doesn't speak. It's only attorney speaking. I say physical evidence simply cries out an explanation. I've heard this afternoon witness all men being set up that we did not raise and then being knocked over by. He talked at great length about threads and fibers and his explanation for where they were. Isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that all these MPs and these people who were trying to track down the rain and all this other stuff, why did they track some back into the living room for the master bedroom? There were a lot of MPs, according in the master bedroom. Why weren't some of those threads somewhere else? Practically, he asked you to believe that only the threads in the living room area were the ones that were tracked, not those somewhere else. He talks about the movement bodies. He spoke of Dr. Neal. He forgot to tell you that Dr. Neal testified from the witness that all the photographs, bodies, or at least some of the photographs, were taken prior to his checking the body. That the picture of the pajama top on Colette McDonald was first taken by James Alexander before Dr. Neal ever got there. A little black and white Polaroid shot. One of the first photographs I think introduced the trial. You recall Dr. Neal says he moved Colette. How did he move her? He goes over here and moves her towards him. He picks up the pajama top. Did he say he went over to the bed and shook it out of the bed? Did he say he went out and shook it out in the club? You didn't hear Mr. Segal explain the club, did you? Not with respect to those two prayers. No mention was made of that. Not one. Dr. Neal's testimony was contradicted by three government witnesses, Avery, Shaw, and Conley, who said that he moved the body of Kristen, but not the body of Colette and Kimberly. But whether you can reconcile that disagree in your minds or not, still does not change the fact that even if you believe Dr. Neal and choose to disbelieve our three witnesses, so what? So what? If the photographs are taken before, if the pajama top doesn't go under the body, then deal. It doesn't change those threads and fibers, which there are more than 60 in that room. He talks about the blood on the feet of Colette McDonald and that it wasn't checked. There is not the slightest indication that the footprint exiting Kristen's room belonged to anybody other than Jeffrey McDonald. The defendant himself on cross-examination said it was probably H.O. Mehta identified. And when you get to the point, we only have his word, and why the picture didn't take it, and Osterberg said, well, you can see it and take a picture of it. Remember that Mehta said he saw the ridge lines with a magnifying glass, and the photography equipment did not have that magnifying equipment. That's why the ridge lines weren't picked up, according to the very testimony of Mehta. Because you didn't see it.
He talked at length about the crime scene and said that we made fun of it. Don't intend to make fun of anything. Certainly not a serious crime scene like. But I do fail to see the strong significance of the movement of things that have little or no evidentiary value. He even spoke about the glasses again today and said that there was blood on there. Yes, there was blood, and the testimony was that it was consistent with that of Christian and inconsistent with that of the defendant. He said that we were talking about the hospital in Hammond. Perhaps that's where it got on there. I don't recall that testimony ever coming or that argument ever coming from the government. Maybe you do. He gave you a long list of people that were at the crime scene. Remember, of course, that all those people were not all there at the very same time. You recall the testimony of the MPs who stayed there a relatively short time. But Ivory didn't make a list of the MPs who were there. If you remember, Bob Shaw said he had someone do that. Ivory did not have to do every little single thing. He talked about the inconsistencies of statements between government witnesses and the defendant himself, and said that we were holding people to their standard. You got to remember one thing. First of all, the government witnesses aren't defendants in a criminal case. Secondly, you got to remember two or three things. Secondly, the defendant isn't attempting to, the government witnesses aren't attempting to live and get their freedom by their statements. But most importantly, he is showing inconsistencies between one and another witness, not an inconsistency between a witness statement and his subsequent statement at some later time. I submit to you that there's tremendous difference when you say A and B disagree and A disagree with A. It's quite different, I would submit. He talks about the pajama top and queries. I think by implication he said that McDonald said it was ripped in the master bedroom. McDonald said he took it off in the master bedroom, and he did not hear a ripping sound. And McDonald said he doesn't know where it was torn, and he cannot come by his counsel and tell you that now we do know where it was torn. But in any event, we don't disagree necessarily on that. We believe it was torn in the master bedroom. He talks about the fact that there were few yards. It would have been few yards because it wasn't torn in a seam area. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Stonewall did in fact testify that blue pajama top was in fact torn in a seam area as well as other. He talks about the sheet and the bedspread and the fact that you cannot draw any conclusions from that because it was tacky, it was put together in a bag. Well, I recall his own defendant expert, John Thornton, whom Wade Smith has just said was outstanding, said that there was a white cuff of the blue pajama top on that sheet. The defendant cannot have it both ways, ladies and gentlemen. You need to identify impressions on that sheet, or you can't. You remember the testimony of Paul Stonewall, who said with respect to how long it takes the blood to dry. And the shoulder area in which he said there was a small amount of blood would have taken 5 to 6 minutes to dry. To say now that when it was moved, all the blood was wet and that's where all the impressions came from, I think certainly begs the question on that. And we submit to you that that testimony concerning that sheet and the impression on it is still extreme. He talked about the pajama top on the wet and something that to show exposed brick. He forgot to mention that, of course, whether or not you can see something like that and show up in a picture depends in great degree on the camera angle that you're taking the picture from. Ladies and gentlemen, I also think I heard him say that we contend that the pajama top was torn in Kristen's room, and there weren't many threads there. No, we haven't said the pajama top was torn in Kristen's room. I think there's a very valid explanation of why there are getting threads there. I think most of them simply was taken there. I think that's why there are very few threads. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant has testified on numerous occasions he found was stacked high, and that he had always testified voluntarily, which I think is true. But you've got to remember something, ladies and gentlemen. And the defense keeps making a big thing out of the fact that this 1970, same 1970, forgetting to tell you that in 1971 and 1974, every single, but a tremendous amount of this evidence was reanalyzed by the FBI, and that the new investigation that resulted in this analysis and much of this evidence was done at the specific request of the defendant himself. Again, I think the defendant is seeking to have it both ways. The defendant has told his story many times. The physical evidence has become additionally known at different times. For example, we know different things after 1970 that he did not know at the Article 32 proceedings, or the military did not know the military proceedings that too. Sometimes you have to change the story to keep up with where the evidence is going. He stated that the blood test in the living room was suspect. But of course, the Benzodine test, while it may give you a false positive, does not give you a false negative. And even John Bolton himself said it was a very specific test for the identity of blood. They said they gave you an explanation why there was blood in Kristen's right. The blood for the footprint could have come from. I think he said the defendant could have carried it there and went and food. But the problem with that is the only A-type blood is in the footprint. It's not in a pool or something. It's not in a different location. It's in the footprint. If it's in the footprint, I submit to you it is not rational to say it got there through any of the three ways which the defendant elected. Ladies and gentlemen, we talked about motive. What is the motive again for the institution? I'm not going to go back into that as I did this morning. But at the same time, you think about motive for the defendant. While he's not required to prove the motive, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And if he says, where's your motive over here? Well, okay, we'll say, where's your motive? And I submit to you when you compare them, ours is better. Ladies and gentlemen, they went at great lengths to discredit the pajama tire. And I think that's deserved. I think, well, they should. I would too. You know why? Because it's mighty, mighty damning. Shirley Green did not say, as I recall of her testimony, that she did follow Paul Steinball's theories on exit and entry rooms. She said she did. The big difference between did and didn't. You recall the FBI report, and I mentioned this morning, I'm sorry, but I've got to mention it. Paul Steinball said he saw several holes, not this is correctly stated, that had the appearance of entry hole and some had the appearance of exit hole. But he also concluded, a couple paragraphs down, that because he got the pajama top a year and a half after the crime, it was impossible to determine the holes were entry or exit holes. I submit to you that their attack on the pajama top reconstruct is a false, based on a false premise. They read you part of Steinwall's testimony and tried to imply that he changed his story. You remember what he said? He said we refolded it exactly the same. And they did. They put the left sleeve on the floor. They took the right sleeve and put it inside out. And they put it as best they could on a mannequin or something. Steinwall never said we placed it. in the same position. There's a big difference in the words place and the word refold. The fact that 48 thrusts, a 21 thrust through the pajama top can make 48 holes is a singular significant fact. I tell you, proves to me beyond a reasonable doubt that Jeffrey McDonald killed his wife and co. And it's a very short leap from that to say that he killed the other two as well. We have never said that the defendant faked his injuries. We're not contending that. I don't know whether he faked them or not. I don't know there's anything. We only tried to compare and contrast the injuries that he received with the injuries he received, and tell you they were not of the same consistency. The fibers at the end of the hall, there's no evidence in this case linking those fibers to the blue pajama top. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Segal said that there's tremendous evidence. The ice stick, the 2 knives, and the club, and said the club probably came from back in the well of the house. If you recall the testimony of Bob Shaw, who said he looked in that area, didn't see him. But here we've got 4 intruders coming to the house, perhaps without any weapons, and finding the crime scene along with surgical gloves. Isn't that incredible, ladies and gentlemen? The people Dylan saw, the person Micah saw, Elena Stokely doesn't say she had a weapon. Posey didn't say that Elena had a weapon. He said there was something in her hands. Paring knives. Everybody who testified on the stand said that the guy had knives. The item, hammer, I submit to you worthy of belief. You can recall her testimony. She changed her mind, true. She said she was scared and frightened when she was first interviewed. She was 15 or 16 years of age. Military staff has said there was a knife stick. The defendant has said there was not a knife stick that he knew of. What? Recall the testimony. The defendant. He said he had never seen that club. And yet his attorney gets a large part, and you could reasonably infer that Johnny Paul was kept back here. Again, I submit to you that is the defendant seeking to have it both ways. Again, he says, how did those weapons get outside the back of the house? And it was impossible to throw them out. You know, a man who's killed his hand and go out hunting, I suppose. And I don't think it's too difficult to bring the door, throw weapons at the door. We submit to you that that is precisely what occurred. The girl that Micah saw doesn't fit their theory, not ours. Our case is not based on theory. Our case is based on fact. The girl, no boots. No, his story doesn't fit their theory as well as our case. But it fits our case perhaps better than it does their theory. Because it's quite plausible that Dylan saw these people. It's also quite plausible that the defendant saw them. What's the problem? Dylan saw them at 12, and their description might not match the description the defendant gave of what they were wearing. And finally, they go after Helena again. The only thing I'm going to say about Helena Stokely, because you can talk about race, you can talk about going to the funeral, you can talk about wearing black, you can talk about killing a cat, you can talk about witchcraft, you can talk about anything you want to. But you can't overcome the one fact that the defendant in 1970, if the Article 32 was shown or photographed and said he had not seen the pole. Now, how do you get around that? I think that takes care of Helena Stokely. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say in closing, as we said this morning, that this is a difficult case, not because the evidence is difficult. It is caught because of the people involved. The Gustavs who've been injured, will be injured for the rest of their lives, regardless of your verdict. Mrs. McDonald, who's been injured and will be injured the rest of her life, because regardless of their friends who will suffer the same thing. And I guess the defendant himself. You know, I'm sure it's very sad for everybody who knew these people to look at those photographs. I think it's very sad for people who knew these people to look at pictures. Halloween, the Christmas. I wish more than you know that we could have shown that kind of picture. I wish more than you know we weren't here. I wish more than you know that I did not think the evidence pointed to the defendant. I think the supreme tragedy in this whole thing really is, if our evidence is correct, and the defendant did it, which we believe he did, think for a moment of the last minutes Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen, when they realized that they were going to die. And they realized for the first and the last time who it was going to make them die. It's incredible. It's unbelievable, as it says. You wouldn't think it. People have said he's not that kind of guy. But ladies and gentlemen, people do strange things. Man's again humanity tonight. But we think he did. For that we're sorry. For that you have an awesome burden and responsibility. You've got to decide beginning tomorrow what the evidence is and what your verdict will be. We believe strongly as we don't want to believe, that he did it and he is guilty of count 1 of first-degree murder, of count 2 first-degree murder, and count 3 of first-degree murder. And I ask you to so find. Thank you.
Could somebody, if you're through with all these easels and the exhibits and so forth, I'd like to renew my acquaintance with the jury. The jury, you have now heard 2 phases of the trial. You have heard the evidence and the argument of counsel. To instruct you as to the applicable law. Because of the lateness of the hour, court will not undertake to do that tonight, but we'll reconvene tomorrow morning, at which time the instructions will be given to you. It's estimated around 45 minutes of it, more or less. We can either come at 9 or 9:30 tomorrow morning. So many as would prefer to come at 9:30. Well, 9, I don't know. So many as would prefer to come at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, raise you. I seem to sense that more of you would prefer to convene at 9 than at 9:30, so as to get in the full morning's work on the case, or however long it takes. And Let me hasten to add that there will be no hurrying of you in your deliberations of this case. You have been very patient and prompt in your attendance on the court. No member of this jury who does not realize the seriousness of the business at hand. So we will continue to take such time as is necessary to get it to a conclusion. Suppose then, unless there is someone who has some plan of something that it will interfere with, would come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Is that all right? All right, then suppose we let the jury retire then, with this final reminder that you must not yet talk about the case among yourselves or with others. Don't let anybody talk to you about it. Be very careful. I'll ask you the first thing tomorrow morning if there's anybody who has read anything or listened to anything on a radio or seen anything on television about it. You're not to do that. Observe those instructions very carefully, please. And finally, keep open minds about the case. You have not heard the legal instructions, but you will hear them tomorrow morning, and we'll convene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Have a good night. Safe trip home and back. You tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We'll let this jury retire, and everyone else will remain seated, and we'll take our own first test. All right, take a recess till tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, please.
All right. So in that case, this court now enters the evening recess. Before reconvening for further dispatch business tomorrow morning is 9 o'clock. Various poem, yeah, because we'll see possibly. Yeah, I'm sorry to do that. Next year,